President George W. Bush is traveling to New Orleans today, 10 years after Hurricane Katrina made landfall. It was there in 2006 that Mr. Bush promised not to abandon the city and urged Congress to direct more oil and gas revenue to restoring wetlands. Last night, President Obama applauded the progress New Orleans has made.
What started out as a natural disaster became a man-made disaster, a failure of government to look out for its own citizens.
Joining us now is a man who was directly involved with the recovery effort there, former FEMA Director Michael Brown. Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning.
And you've got an op-ed out in Politico this morning titled, "Stop Blaming Me for Hurricane Katrina." From your perspective, Michael, as we look at 10 years post-Katrina, what really happened?
You know, the first major tipping point was about 72 hours prior to Katrina making landfall. I had reached out to the National Hurricane Center Director, Max Mayfield, and said, Max, I can't get the mayor and the governor to evacuate New Orleans. Would you sound the alarm bell? Would you explain exactly how catastrophic this can be? And that fell on deaf ears. So then I called President Bush down in Crawford, and I said, Mr. President, I have a very strange request, but I need you to call the mayor and use your presidential bully pulpit to try to convince the mayor of New Orleans to evacuate his city. And now we're down to 48 hours. And the president was kind of surprised by that. And I said, well, I'm serious. I really need you to do it. So the president did. He called Mayor Nagin, and now we're down to 48 hours. And then finally on Sunday, sometime between 10 and noon on Sunday, Governor Blanco and Mayor Nagin go in front of the cameras and basically say, you know what, you really ought to get out of town. It's probably time to evacuate. Well, dang it, that's too late.
It was too late.
And the storm made landfall about 4 or 5 o'clock that morning, and consequently, we had 20,000 people in the Superdome. But for the failure to use the planes, the trains, the buses, the failure to use those to get those people out of there is what created the man-made disaster.
So the story is very personal to me. Having graduated from LSU down in Baton Rouge just a couple of years prior to Hurricane Katrina, I had so many friends and family members and families I was very close to involved and affected by Hurricane Katrina. And I know so many have those personal stories. As we look at these images, it is still so difficult and it's still so fresh in our minds. As you look back at these pictures, Michael, what is your biggest regret about that day?
My biggest regret is there were two things that I did, but I wish I'd done better, is when we couldn't get the mayor and the governor to order the evacuation. Now, you got to remember, this is 10 years ago, so we don't have Fox Business. We don't have a lot of the media outlets we have today. But I went on every cable show I could find and tried to encourage people to evacuate. What I really should have done was gotten on the plane then and gone straight to New Orleans and screamed it from the city of New Orleans, and maybe people would have paid attention at that point. I think it was just, here's a guy in D.C. trying to tell people to get out of New Orleans, and I don't think it had the effect that it did. And then as we got into the storm, and I don't know how to explain this succinctly, but with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, I now had an additional layer of bureaucracy on top of me. And as I would ask for it, I would execute a mission assignment that says to the Department of Defense, you know, bring me X number of helicopters, bring me X number of amphibious equipment. That was getting slowed down in the bureaucracy. And I should have stood at the podium and said publicly, I don't know what the hell is going on back in Washington, D.C., but it needs to stop, and these cabinet secretaries need to get off their butts and start doing what I asked for.
All right. And
probably would have gotten me fired, but would have been the right thing to do.
And Michael, we only have a few seconds left, but if you could say where we are today in the recovery effort 10 years later.
We should not be surprised that we haven't recovered that well. This massive bureaucracy, all the rules and regulations that we have, all of the red tape is what slows down recovery. Look at it in New York. It took us 10 years to rebuild, you know, the Freedom Tower. We've got to cut this red tape out of our government.
Michael Brown, thanks for joining us this morning. 10 years later, 10 years after Katrina.